Boldwood presents a new arrival at Duck Pond Cottage, written by Della Galton and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Jade Foster could feel the familiar tension coiling in her stomach as she locked her front door, the key slippery in her fingers. She wiped her hands on her jeans, picked up the cellophane-wrapped bouquet of white roses, and was just turning when she heard the sound of running footsteps on the dirt track that fronted her Wiltshire cottage, followed by a woman's breathless voice. The woman appeared, grey-haired and with a vibrant yellow straw bag flapping from one arm, panting heavily in her front garden. "Oh, I'm so glad I caught you," she gasped. "You are the animal rescue woman, aren't you, dear? They said in the pub I'd find you here, but you're going out?" She paused for breath and added in a bemused voice, "You don't look a bit like I expected." Jade smiled and wondered what her visitor had expected. She was wearing jeans, which had started off black but were now faded to grey, along with a cream t-shirt, one of the few she owned that didn't have a flippant slogan on the back. She'd meant to be smarter to visit the cemetery. It seemed disrespectful to go in her scruffs. She'd clipped back her unruly brown hair and put on mascara, but she hadn't been able to find any more suitable clothes in her wardrobe. Probably because most of them were stuffed in the laundry basket, and laundry was way down her priority list at the moment. "I thought you'd be older," her visitor gasped, "and bigger. Stronger, you know." "I'm stronger than I look," Jade murmured, wondering what she was letting herself in for. Lots of people who turned up at Duck Pond Rescue seemed surprised when they saw her. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to look like. Evidently not tall and slightly built. She hadn't been called Beanpole for nothing at school, and most people were amazed when she told them she was 27, not 17. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, because the woman's face was scarlet with exertion, and there were beads of sweat below the silver rims of her glasses. September had turned into an Indian summer. "Where have you run from?" "Oh, only a little way. My car's parked down on the main road. He flew straight at me, you see. I didn't have a hope of stopping." "A bird?" Jade said, concerned because birds rarely survived run-ins with cars. "Do you know what sort of bird he is?" "Blooming great thing. I was lucky my window wasn't open. He'd have been in the car then, and I'd probably have crashed it. I don't know what kind he is. I don't know anything about birds, see? He's not dead, though. He was fluttering about on the grass verge. I couldn't get anywhere near him. Tried to attack me, he did." She was already backing away down the track. "You will come, won't you?" "Yes, of course I'll come. It was good of you to stop." Jade caught up with her visitor, torn between not wanting to rush her — she was elderly and still out of breath — and worry about getting to the injured bird before a predator did. Mind you, not being able to get near him sounded promising. The bird couldn't be too badly hurt if it was still trying to defend itself. "I hope I'm not holding you up, dear. You were just on your way out, weren't you?" "Yes, I was on my way to see someone, but we didn't have a set time." Understatement, Jade thought, swallowing down a mixture of regret and relief that she had an excuse to put off the inevitable looming confrontation for a little longer. She grabbed a small animal transporter and a net from an outbuilding on her way past and followed the woman back along the lane. She'd been expecting a buzzard. There were dozens in the Wiltshire countryside, but as they got closer to the stricken bird, she realised it was bigger than a buzzard. A lot bigger, and not the right colour either. It had chestnut feathers and a pale-coloured head, almost white, with a yellow hooked beak. Jade frowned, racking her brains. She'd had a friend, Ellen, at vet school who was really into birds. They'd often spent nights chatting about wildlife and about how to recognise the different birds of prey. This bird had distinctive yellow legs and a yellow beak, also a forked tail. "I think it's a red kite," she told her companion with growing excitement. "I've never seen one this close. Until a few years ago, they were virtually extinct in England, but they're common now. The woman eyed her anxiously. You watch yourself, dear. Mind his claws. Poor little lamb's none too happy. Not that I can blame him for that. She hung back. Jade approached cautiously with the net. Poor little lamb were the last words she'd have used to describe the kite. Proud and beautiful, certainly, but this bird of prey was far from a little lamb. Jade felt a surge of admiration as the bird glared at her and tried to rise in flight, but only succeeded in toppling sideways onto the grass verge. Broken wing, Jade guessed. It was surprising it wasn't dead after tangling with a car. Its wingspan must have been a couple of meters. Netting it without injury to either of them was going to be tricky, if not impossible. She contemplated heading to the Red Lion, which was a couple of miles back along the road, and enlisting some help. On the other hand, the pub would have been open since midday. It was now gone for. The last thing she needed was a crowd of rowdy onlookers who fancied themselves as bird experts following her down here. Deciding to have a go on her own, she edged forward. If she could restrain the bird with the net, she might be able to get close enough to immobilize it without frightening it into hurting itself further or injuring her. Luck was on Jade's side for once. When the bird felt the net, it flapped angrily, tried to back its way out, and ended up trapped against the fence that edged the ochre-coloured ploughed fields beyond the road. Taking care to avoid the lethal talons and wickedly hooked beak, Jade tightened the net, and the bird, no longer trying to escape, but shrieking furiously, let her get close enough to touch. Sweat dripped into her eyes as she crouched on the grass verge, and, talking softly all the time, let the bird get used to her presence. All right, my sweetie. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to check out that wing. You are a beauty, aren't you? When a car door slammed close by, Jade assumed the woman had decided to wait in her car, but then she heard a voice. She glanced up and saw a man in jeans and a casual jacket heading her way. Great, that was all she needed, an interfering passerby. Can I help? He paused a few feet away, which she supposed was better than blundering in and frightening her prospective patient. I'm fine, she muttered, wiping sweat out of her eyes. Don't make any sudden movements. I don't want it scared, and please don't come any closer. I wasn't planning on it. His voice was wry, and now she could see him properly. She had an impression of a strong, angular face, fair hair that was slightly too long, and cool grey eyes. I thought you might have broken down, he added, hunkering down on the grass verge, his movement slow and controlled. That's why I stopped. The bird fluttered, aware of his presence, and, distracted, Jade nodded. You could help, if you don't mind. You could open the door in that cage for me and pass it over very slowly. Sure. He did as she said and inched the transporter across the grass towards her. There was one sticky moment when she was edging the bird into it, and the woman, who Jade had forgotten all about, clapped her hands in excitement and shouted out, "Well done, dear! Good for you!" The bird fluttered wildly and extricated a leg from the net, and Jade was only just in time to snatch her fingers out of slicing distance of its talons. She drew the net gently back into place, latched the transporter with a sigh of relief, wiped her face once more with the back of her hand, and stood up slowly. The man who'd stopped to help glanced at her. Nice work. What will you do now? Take it to a vet? No need. I can sort it out myself. I think the wing's broken, but it's not irreparable. It just needs strapping up for a while. If it survives the shock of all the human contact, it'll be fine. I trained as a vet, she added, which was true. I run an animal rescue place now. She'd expected raised eyebrows, which was how people usually reacted, but he just nodded thoughtfully. Good luck. Thanks. And thanks for your help. Pleasure. He gave her a little nod and headed back to a white Toyota which was parked behind the woman's car. "He was a nice young man, wasn't he, dear? I'm Dorothy, by the way. Dot to my friends." The woman's sunny smile told Jade that she was now included in Dot's circle of friends. "I'll give you a lift back up the lane, shall I?" "It's probably better if I walk," Jade said. "Less stressful for our friend here than going in a car. It's not far." "Well, if you're sure, dear." Dot's voice was dubious. "I think it's wonderful what you do. I'm so relieved, I can't tell you. I felt awful when I hit him. I wasn't going very fast. I never do around these country lanes." "It's all right," Jade reassured her. "There's not a lot you can do when they fly straight into you." She wondered if she should ask Dot back for a brandy. She could have done with one herself. And then she remembered she had a prior engagement. She'd been putting it off all day. She was amazed she'd managed to forget about it. "Well, I'd like to give you a donation, dear. It's the least I can do after putting you to all this trouble." Jade shook her head, fully taking in for the first time her companion's appearance. Grey hair, which was coiled in a tight bun, kind faded blue eyes, a face creased with years of worry, and navy blue trousers shiny with age. Living on a pension, Jade decided. "No need for a donation. Thanks again for coming to find me. Lots of people wouldn't have stopped." She watched the woman drive away, and then she lifted the transporter, which wasn't much heavier with the bird in situ than it had been when it was empty. She would settle her patient in more permanent accommodation and leave it alone for the night. Then she really should get going before dusk fell. She'd rather have dealt with a dozen birds of prey than go where she'd been heading before Dot had interrupted her, but there could be no more putting it off. Bracing her back slightly and feeling guilty that she even wanted to put it off, Jade quickened her step. It wasn't long before she could see light glinting off the duck pond that had given both the lane and her cottage its name, and the weeping willow that overhung it like some dark green sentinel came into view. Chapter 2. Having settled the bird and left it water, Jade locked up the converted pigsty, which she referred to lightly as the hospital block, and went to collect the white roses she'd abandoned by her front door. Then she strolled along the quiet roads past untidy hedges that spilled out like overgrown mops of hair, revelling in the peace and enjoying the clear, honey-coloured light of the September evening. 10 minutes later, she was letting herself through the lichen-covered gate of the churchyard, aware of the small wooden thud as it swung shut behind her. She walked slowly along the mossy cobbled path between the graves. It seemed rude to run through a cemetery, disrespectful somehow, and however much she longed for this visit to be over, she didn't want to offend anyone. These people, whose headstones rose higgledy-piggledy from the ground on either side of her, seemed almost like friends. Their names were so familiar, and she'd often wondered about their lives. There was a newish headstone close to the path, which she always noticed because it had been erected just after she'd started coming here. Benjamin and Evie McTaggart. Together again. From the dates, it looked as though Evie had died a few weeks after her husband. How sad. There was a pot of wilting yellow carnations, which seemed out of place somehow. More of a wedding flower. Jade paused to trail her fingers over the twin cherubs on their final resting place. She knew she was putting off the moment of confrontation. Silly to still think of it as a confrontation. Yet a year of coming here hadn't made things any more bearable than they'd been in the beginning. Sighing, she continued on until she was in one of the most peaceful parts of the cemetery, shaded as it was by a giant oak. Its leaves were caught halfway between summer and autumn. Soon they would fall, but for now they shone gloriously orange in the liquid golden light that preceded sunset. She halted, her heart pounding, by the gleaming milk-white headstone with its marble angel, wings folded peacefully and head bowed, eyes cast forever downwards. Elizabeth Foster, 16th September, 1969. to 21st September, 2023. Rest in peace. Such a simple epitaph for such a complex woman, Jade had thought at the time, but she'd been unable to think of anything else to say. She'd always had trouble knowing what to say to her mother. And when she'd died so unexpectedly of a stroke just before her 54th birthday, it had suddenly been too late for words. "Hi, Mum," she whispered, pausing for a few moments and feeling a little shiver run across her bare arms. It still felt odd to be talking to a grave, as if her mother could somehow hear her from beneath 6 feet of soil. And why should she be listening in death when she had never listened in life, Jade wondered, as she knelt on the dusty ground. She laid the white roses on the grave and stroked their petals, feeling their cool perfection beneath her fingertips. Silken and unscented, so perfect on the outside, but with something vital missing, like Jade's childhood had been. She'd had everything she'd ever wanted in material terms: her own pony, piano lessons, swimming lessons, ice skating lessons, and a string of childminders to take the place of her mother, whose hotel business paid for it all. On the outside, she'd had an idyllic rural upbringing, which she knew that her school friends, with the exception of her best friend Sarah, who was far more perceptive than most, had envied madly. But she'd have swapped it all for the chance to have spent more time with her mother, instead of being looked after by strangers. She sat back on the warm ground and hugged her knees to her chest. The Alston Court Hotel, her mother's flagship hotel, and also the one where they'd lived, had been a business, not a home. And the biggest regret of her life was that she'd never really known the woman who now lay beneath this Wiltshire soil, and now she never would. "The sanctuary is coming along well," she murmured. "I rescued a red kite today. A bird of prey. Beautiful." She tailed off because even as she spoke, she could see the disappointment in her mother's dark eyes and hear her voice in her head, contemptuous and impatient. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Jade, most people grow out of wanting to save the world when they're about 12. Guilt washed over her. It left a deep uneasiness in her, even now, knowing that her mother would have been furious that she'd sold the family business, the 4 hotels, including the flagship Alston Court, and spent the money on buying a smallholding. This included an old cottage with 5 acres of land, stables, and several farm buildings. It had been the perfect place to set up an animal rescue centre. Jade knew Elizabeth would have scorned her plans, but she'd gone ahead and done it anyway, rebelling after her mother's death in a way she'd never dared to do while she was alive. She hadn't spent all of the money. She had a large chunk of it invested too, so maybe she'd inherited some of her mother's hard-headed business acumen after all. Now Jade swiped a stray tear from her eye, not sure whether the hard knot of grief in her chest was down to guilt or pain because she'd never been allowed to get close to her mother. Never been allowed inside the barriers her mother had erected. "Your father would have stayed if it wasn't for you," she'd told Jade once. "He never wanted kids. He had big plans. Thought kids would get in the way. Pity he didn't hang around to see how wrong he was." She'd smiled at the young Jade as she'd spoken, and with the benefit of hindsight, Jade knew her words were intended to be a comfort, not a rejection, but it hadn't felt like that at the time. Her parents would have stayed together if it hadn't been for her. That still hurt. It hurt desperately. Especially as her mother had never married again, but thrown herself into the business of building her hotel empire, dating periodically, but never getting close to anyone. Jade let the tears fall for a while. She often cried here when she was alone, although strangely, she'd shed no tears at the funeral. Perhaps she was still hoping for absolution, she thought, rising slowly to her feet, wanting desperately to be away from this place of shadows, which seemed to encapsulate all that had been wrong in her life for so long. She hurried back through the churchyard, her vision so blurred with tears she didn't see the man until she'd collided with him. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, glancing up into startled grey eyes that softened immediately as he looked at her.
No problem. Hey, are you all right? No, you're not, are you?
It was him, the man who'd stopped to help her earlier. Recognition softened his voice, and Jade bit her lip, embarrassed to be caught crying. She wanted to run past, but he was blocking the path, so she stayed where she was, trying to sniff inconspicuously and wishing he'd leave her alone. He looked vaguely familiar. She'd thought so earlier, but now she was less distracted, it was more apparent. Perhaps he worked in the village. Perhaps he was one of the business owners she'd approached about sponsorship for Duck Pond Rescue. It was his eyes, she thought, frowning. His grey eyes were comfortingly familiar, yet she was almost sure they hadn't met before today. "We must stop meeting like this," she muttered, trying to bring some levity into the situation, but spoiling it when she had to swipe more tears from her face with the back of her hand because she hadn't brought a hanky.
People will talk.
He finished the phrase for her, rummaged in his pocket, and pulled out a mini pack of tissues.
I'm not following you, in case you were wondering. I've been visiting my grandparents. They're in that plot over there.
He gestured with the tissues and then handed them to her.
Here, have these.
She took the pack, grateful he hadn't claimed to know how she felt or offered any of the usual platitudes. Practical help she could deal with. Anything else would have felt like an intrusion. He waited while she blew her nose, not looking at her but not looking embarrassed either, as if he was quite used to dealing with sobbing women. Even through her distress, she thought how kind he was. She racked her brain to work out why he was so familiar. "What did you say your name was?" she asked, when she was in control of herself again.
I didn't, but it's Finn McTaggart. I'm not local, although I did spend quite a bit of time down here when I was younger. My grandparents retired here, but Dad and I still live in Nottingham. We're here to sort out their house, and I thought I'd pop by, say hello to them. You know how it is.
She nodded. "I'm Jade Foster. I know your grandparents. Well, what I mean is that I know their grave. I pass it every time I come. Yellow carnations. You didn't lose them long ago." She stumbled to a halt, aware of how inane she must sound. He put the carnations there, of course, and she had just trampled like an idiot over his feelings. "I've been visiting my mum," she mumbled, feeling her face burn. "It's a year today since—" She tailed off, unsure what else to say to him. It felt slightly surreal, standing in the swiftly gathering mosquito-edged dusk, crying in front of a stranger. She clutched the pack of tissues, wondering whether she should offer them back. There were only a couple left. "Well, thanks for these."
You're welcome.
His eyes were sympathetic.
And believe me, it does get easier, Jade. I promise.
"Right," Jade said, touched by his kindness, but anxious to get away. She was beginning to feel supremely embarrassed that he'd seen her in such a state. He'd think she wasn't capable of looking after herself, let alone running an animal rescue. Annoyed with herself, she looked back into his eyes, her gaze steady. "Well, thanks again," she muttered, relieved when he moved out of her path. "I'd better get going." Chapter 3. Finn watched her hurry back along the moss-covered path and reflected wryly that after 2 chance meetings, he should have taken the opportunity to ask for her number so he could see her again. Except that at neither time would it have been appropriate. Then he chided himself for assuming she'd be interested in him, or even single. He'd thought she was lovely earlier, and she was, even with her nose red from crying and the strands of her long dark hair that had escaped from their clips in a scatter around her face. Her eyes, almost black with pain, had looked haunted, and even though everyone was vulnerable when they were visiting their lost loved ones, he'd sensed she didn't usually do vulnerability. He'd had to fight back the urge to put his arms around her slender shoulders and hold her tightly. He told himself he'd have felt the same towards any woman so obviously in need of comfort, but he suspected it wasn't true.
Forget it,
he muttered crossly. Why on earth would she take a second look at him? She'd barely taken a first look, he reminded himself, as he watched her fumbling with the latch on the gate and tear up the road. She'd been too preoccupied with rescuing the bird, and this time she'd been too blinded with grief to see where she was going, poor kid. She was young to have lost her mother. He hoped she had someone back home who was supporting her through it. Losing a parent was terribly tough. His mother wasn't dead, but he'd lost her just the same. He waited until Jade was out of sight, sensing her need for distance, and then strolled back to his grandparents' cottage, which was less than a quarter of a mile from the cemetery. He still thought of it as theirs, even though they'd left it to his father when they'd died within weeks of each other 8 months earlier.
You took your time, lad. Thought you'd got lost.
Ray greeted him from the front garden, where he was puffing furiously on a roll-up, and Finn realised his father must feel the same. His grandmother had never let anyone smoke in the house.
I bumped into a girl in the churchyard. I saw her earlier too,
he added, frowning and deciding not to tell Ray about the bird rescue, as the only birds he was interested in came fully plucked, cooked with gravy.
Oh, aye, you were supposed to be sorting out graves, not chatting up women.
Finn watched him draw on the thin roll-up so deeply that the burning end shot towards his fingers and he had to drop it on the path.
That stuff will kill you one day. I wish you'd pack it in. Too late now. I reckon I've done all the damage I'm going to do.
Finn doubted that very much, but his dad could be a stubborn old fool where his health was concerned.
And I wasn't chatting her up. She was upset. She was visiting her mother's grave.
Ah, Ray said, and promptly shut up. 1-0 to me, Finn thought, without much satisfaction, as he went past his father and into the house. The mention of mothers worked every time, but he'd have given a lot for things to be different. He was doing a Wordle on his phone when Ray came into the back room.
Shall I do us some burnt sausage and chips again for tea, or shall we risk the pub? The pub, I think.
Finn glanced up.
I could do with a pint of Guinness.
And he could ask the landlord about Jade, too, he decided, as they strolled down to the Red Lion. Mike would know who she was. He knew everything that was going on in the village and was an incorrigible gossip. He looked pleased to see them, too, Finn saw, as he pushed open the heavy oak door, lowering his head as they stepped into the dark beamed interior. They weren't here often enough to be classed as locals, but often enough for Mike to know what they drank.
Usual, is it, gentlemen?
He queried, grinning through his salt and pepper beard and rubbing his hands together. He'd have looked more at home behind the bar of a seafaring pub strung with fish nets holding plastic lobsters, Finn had often thought. Captain Birdseye. Deciding against asking about the girl in the cemetery, he carried their pints to the table where his father sat. He didn't want it to get back to her he'd been asking, and it more than likely would if he said anything to Mike.
Do you two want the wood burner lit? Mike called after him. It's a bit chilly once the sun goes down, isn't it? No, you're all right, Ray said, rubbing his hands together as Finn settled opposite him. We're from up north. We don't feel the cold. Not like you soft southerners.
Finn didn't catch Mike's disparaging reply. This was a nice pub, he thought, trying to decide if it had changed since the last time they'd been down. No, the Red Lion probably hadn't changed much in the last couple of 100 years. It was a piece of old England, with its thick cob walls, ancient beams and big old inglenook fireplace. Their local, the Sheaf of Arrows, was more working man's club, with pitted tables lined by faded velveteen seats that you sank into when you sat down because the springs had long since gone. The walls were dotted with black and white pictures of football teams that no one had ever heard of. The walls of the Red Lion sported ancient hunting prints and a couple of faded watercolours. Above the bar hung a banner printed with the words, "A good wine should be drunk and not worshipped. A good landlord should be worshipped and not drunk."
So, what's the verdict, son?
Ray asked, swigging his pint and interrupting Finn's musings.
Do we let the place go to rack and ruin for lack of funds, or do we cut our losses and put it on the market? It's yours. What do you want to do with it?
Finn asked, even though he had a pretty good idea he already knew. His father had never really taken to the countryside. He was much happier in his terraced 2-up, 2-down in Nottingham, steeped in traffic fumes and noise and surrounded by tarmac. He'd never been one for open spaces and wild animals, as he called them, which covered everything from rabbits to cows. I think we should get it on the market, lad. I could buy my place then. Might even get enough for you to put a deposit down on a little place yourself.
Yes,
Finn replied, without enthusiasm. As far as he could see, his grandparents had had the right idea. Who wanted to live in the city when they could be surrounded by clean air and rolling fields? Ever since they'd died and left his father the cottage, he'd harboured the faint hope he could somehow raise the funds to buy it and move down. He was sure he could get work locally. He could turn his hand to most things, and in his spare time he could paint pictures, a passion for as long as he could remember. His grandparents, particularly his grandmother, had encouraged his artistic endeavours. A couple of his early landscapes still hung in the cottage. Dad, who was more practical, a man's man, had never been as enamoured.
You'll never earn a living with a paintbrush, lad. Not that kind of paintbrush, anyways.
He was probably right. Finn knew it was a pipe dream, really. Cottages in the Alston countryside, a stone's throw from the beautiful medieval city of Salisbury, even tiny cottages, which needed a lot of money spending on them, didn't come cheap. He knew his dad couldn't afford to sell it to him for much less than the market value, not unless he wanted to spend the rest of his life scrimping and saving, which Finn was determined he wasn't going to do. Consequently, he hadn't ever raised the subject.
Course, you've probably got better memories of the place than me, eh, lad?
Ray said slyly.
Wild, drunken Christmas parties, if my memory serves me right. I was young and foolish then. Not that young, 25 if my memory serves me.
Yeah, all right, but it was a one-off. Finn frowned, which is why Gran never forgot it.
She never forgot it because you were sick all the way up her stairs.
Ray drained his pint triumphantly, leaned forward and tapped his empty glass on the table.
Want another one? It's my round.
I'll get them. Finn escaped to the bar because that was one night he particularly didn't want to remember and certainly didn't want to discuss. He'd had the worst hangover of his life the following morning. Being sick all up the stairs hadn't been good, but it had been a fairly minor crime in the scheme of things. The Christmas party had been held in someone's house on the outskirts of the village. He'd been drinking with a group of lads in the Red Lion, and when the pub had closed, they'd invited him along. The alcohol had flowed freely, and Finn had drunk far more than he was used to. He vaguely remembered leaving the party with a really pretty blonde who'd been younger than him. He wished he could blank out the rest of the evening, but he couldn't. He'd hated himself for weeks afterwards. Not because the girl hadn't been willing. She'd been just as keen as he was to find a quiet spot where they could get to know each other better. But he'd known they were both too drunk to have really known what they were doing, and it wasn't Finn's style to have one-night stands. What had made it worse was that he'd had to leave for Nottingham the following morning, which meant he hadn't had time to see her again. What would he have said if he had, he wondered? Sorry? Or thanks? Or maybe even, what did you say your name was? He doubted they'd have seen each other again. A few minutes of fumbled love-making in a freezing, muddy field wasn't the best start to a relationship. He'd never seen her since, which he supposed wasn't all that surprising. Alston wasn't a tiny village. There was no reason to bump into her, even if she had been a local. Perhaps, like him, she'd been far from home and had simply done too much celebrating. He sighed and headed back to their table with the drinks. Maybe his father had a point about it being best to cut all ties with the place. Nottingham was home. It was where his mates were, where his roots were, and very probably where his future lay. Moving to the countryside, swapping his job at the electrical engineers and trying to paint pictures for a living were all pipe dreams. Fleetingly, he thought about Jade again, and rationality kicked in. Another pipe dream. There were plenty of attractive women in Nottingham.
I think you're right, Dad,
he said, clunking their pints onto the knotted wooden table and watching a thin trail of froth spill down one of the glasses.
You should put it on the market. We don't get a lot of use out of it, do we? Do you want me to nip down the estate agents in the morning? Aye, thanks, lad. You're better at all that malarkey than me.
Ray's grey eyes lit briefly with warmth, and Finn thought with a mixture of regret and relief that it was probably for the best. Chapter 4. Jade shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun and watched the two people she loved most in the world heading up the yard towards her. Sarah Tate, her best friend forever, and her son Ben, who was 5.5, which wasn't much older than Sarah and Jade had been when they'd first met at school. Ben was the image of his mother. It really hit her when she saw them side by side like this. He had the same honey-coloured hair with streaks that were bleached almost white from playing outside over the long summer holidays. A smattering of freckles curved across his cheekbones, and he had the same small nose as Sarah's and the same eyes. No, he didn't, she thought with a small frown. Ben's eyes weren't the same shape, and they were grey, not summer blue. His shorts and t-shirt were a lot grubbier than her friend's too, she saw, smiling as they got closer. Then Ben spotted her standing by the kennels, dragged his hand from his mother's, and came hurtling up the dusty concrete yard.
Can I see Sasha's puppies, Auntie Jade? Have they grown any bigger? How's the little black one? I bet he's as fat as a piglet.
The words tumbled out in one long, unbroken line.
Can I help give Sasha her dinner? Mum said you might let me if I was really good and quiet.
It was impossible to imagine him being quiet for long. Jade smiled into his eyes, which were as wide and innocent as he could make them. Of course you can, sweetheart. She bent to kiss his head, ignoring his screwed-up face as her lips brushed his hair. He was going through the kissing is for girls stage Sarah had told her last time they'd spoken. So how is school, Ben? Is it good to be back?
We did maths today. Boring, double boring, treble boring.
Ben spun out the words dramatically.
I like art best. We did that yesterday. Mrs. Benson said I'm really good. I did a picture of a horse like Rosanna with brown hair and a white patch on her head.
Did you now? Jade said, straightening and looking across to where Rosanna grazed in the paddock, flicking away flies with her tail.
I'd love to see that sometime.
Sarah caught up with her son, puffing in the heat of the day and flapping her pink t-shirt with her hands to get some airflow. Still hard at it, I see. She eyed the pot of wood stainer at Jade's feet. Did you realise you've got that stuff in your hair?
It washes out.
Jade pulled a section of her long dark hair in front of her face to look and wrinkled her nose.
Yuck. It doesn't make very good perfume, though.
I should get this cut. It would be much more practical. It wouldn't suit you. Sarah grinned. So, how's it going? You look as though you're getting somewhere at last. She looked around the small holding, narrowing her eyes approvingly. You've transformed this place. It almost looks like an animal sanctuary, which reminds me, the woman across the road from me can't keep her dog anymore because her grandchildren are asthmatic. Would she be able to bring it here? It's a cockapoo, I think. It looks just like a rug on legs. You might have a job rehoming it. There'll be someone out there who'll love him, Jade said, feeling a stab of sadness because she knew Sarah was right. When she'd been at vet school in Bristol, she'd helped out at a local dog's home, and people did seem to go for looks, passing over the scruffier ones and the older dogs in their quest for cute. Still, at least she was in a position to do something about it now. And if I don't find him a home, he can stay here forever, she added, touching Sarah's arm. That's why I started this place. It feels so good to actually be able to do something. When I worked at the vets, I used to feel so helpless when people brought their unwanted animals in for us to... She didn't finish the sentence, but spread her arms wide to encompass the kennels and fields. She'd dreamed of being a vet, but the reality had put her off. There'd been a visit to a slaughterhouse as part of their training, and Jade, a lifelong vegetarian, had known she could no more witness an animal being slaughtered than she could fly to the moon.
I've decided to call this place Duck Pond Rescue, she told Sarah now. What do you think?
Sarah clicked her tongue. Very apt, as you live in Duck Pond Cottage in Duck Pond Lane, and there's that flaming great overgrown pond across the road.
That pond's an iconic landmark, I'll have you know.
Sarah rolled her eyes. If you say so, but Duck Pond Rescue isn't exactly original. Couldn't you have called it Paws and Claws or Heaven's End or something like that?
Too trite.
Jade knew she was an odd mixture. She couldn't do trite and corny any more than she could do death and destruction. Sarah glanced around them.
Why are there 2 lots of kennels? This is the quarantine block. It's for when new dogs come in. You have to have somewhere to segregate them in case there's anything wrong with them. The block further down is the regular kennels, and I've got the cattery sorted now too. Someone brought a cat in last week. Poor little mite had hardly any fur left. He got trapped under the bonnet of a car and driven for miles before the owner realised he was there.
Is he all right? Sarah gasped in horror. Did you sort him out?
It was touch and go, but yes, he'll be fine. I've called him Diesel because it seemed appropriate. I think I might keep him.
You'll be overrun at this rate. I thought the idea was to rehome them, not keep them.
I'll only keep the odd one. Did you see the chicken run I've just set up in the small field? I scrounged it from a farmer up the road, along with some of his ex-battery hens. I like chickens.
Ben saw it. I had to drag him out of it by his ankles. That's how he got so filthy. He's almost as crazy as you are about animals.
Jade laughed.
He'll clean up. I've got another bird he'd like to see. It's a red kite, a bird of prey. It ran into a woman's car out on the main road a couple of days ago and injured its wing.
So you're taking in wildlife as well. Isn't that the council's responsibility? I hope the woman left a donation.
She wanted to, but she didn't look like she could afford it, so I didn't let her.
You can't afford it either. Sarah shook her head. Jade, you're way too soft. Your mum's money won't last forever.
It'll last a while, and I've done well on the sponsorship lately. I've got 3 businesses in the village, including the Red Lion and the vets, who've agreed to regular funding.
Sarah didn't look that convinced, so Jade changed the subject.
I've hardly seen you lately. I take it the romance is still going strong?
Colour crept across Sarah's freckled cheekbones.
You've been busy with this place. I didn't like to intrude while you were setting things up, but yes, it is. Callum's great. He adores Ben.
Good.
Jade glanced at her friend's face, which looked hotter than the sun warranted.
So when do I get to meet him? Or are you keeping him under wraps forever? I'm beginning to think there's something wrong with him, or is it me you're ashamed of? Your crazy friend with the animals' sanctuary.
Of course I'm not ashamed of you. Sarah sounded genuinely affronted. I just didn't want to tempt fate, in case things didn't work out between us, you know.
There was probably an element of truth in that, although Jade had a feeling there was more to it. She suspected Sarah was being cagey about Callum for reasons that had nothing to do with tempting fate.
You can come round for tea one night if you like. Sarah picked a piece of straw out of Ben's hair. How about Friday? I'll get Callum to cook us something. He's utterly gorgeous, Jade, and he can cook too. Very important, as I can't. Did I tell you his dad's a chef?
Once or twice,
Jade quipped. She took a deep breath of the balmy Wiltshire air and turned her face up to the sun, which was still warm despite it being late afternoon. There was a part of her that still couldn't believe she was really here, doing what she'd wanted to do all her life.
So what have you told Callum about Ben's father?
She asked casually, when Ben was out of earshot, running ahead of them to the newly installed cattery. She stole a glance at Sarah's face and could tell by her fleeting look of panic she was right on target. That was why she hadn't been allowed to meet Callum yet, in case she inadvertently let something slip. Feeling a little put out that Sarah might not trust her, she added softly,
I am on your side, you know. I'd back up whatever you said.
Yes, I know you would. Sarah glanced at her son, who'd paused just ahead and was crouched in the dust, staring intently at something on the ground. She hesitated, and then, aware that Jade wasn't going to let her get away with that, she added, "To be honest, I haven't told Callum much. I just said that Ben's father was much older than me and did a runner before Ben was born."
But isn't it going to be difficult, Sarah? When he finds out the truth? It sounds to me as though you're pretty serious about this guy.
He won't find out. He can't. You're the only person who knows. Sarah flicked back her shaggy blonde mane and gave Jade a sharp sideways glance. "And you're not going to tell anyone, are you?"
"My lips are sealed."
Jade smiled to soften the seriousness of her voice, because it did worry her that Sarah was still living a lie. Not because she hadn't confessed to Callum, after all, they'd only been seeing each other a few weeks, but because Jade knew her friend had never faced the truth herself. She didn't want Ben's father in her life, and because of that, she'd denied Ben the chance of ever knowing him either. Jade and Sarah were the same age, 27, and they'd been best friends forever, but in many ways they were worlds apart. It bothered Jade a lot more than it seemed to bother Sarah that Ben was growing up without a dad. He was growing up without grandparents too, because Sarah had fallen out with her adoptive parents a couple of years after he'd been born. A deeply moral and traditional older couple, they hadn't liked the fact she'd refused to trace his father and was determined to bring him up alone, and in the end, Sarah, who was the most stubborn person Jade had ever met, had cut contact with them too. Jade hoped Sarah would reconcile with them one day, but she knew what it was like to have parents who weren't on the same wavelength as you. She knew what it was like to grow up without a father too. But one day, Ben might want to put a face to the man who'd helped to conceive him, and Jade was worried about how Sarah would cope when he did. Although, to be fair, Jade had never tried to trace her own father. Some deep-down pride prevented her from chasing after a man who'd clearly never wanted to know her. "Enough of my love life, how's yours?" Sarah asked, fanning her face with her hand and pausing to check on Ben, who was now heading purposefully across the small field towards the chickens. "Is he all right in there, Jade?"
"Yes, he's fine. It doesn't matter if he lets them out. I'll deal with them later."
"Has that hunky vet persuaded you to go out with him yet?"
"If you mean Aiden Southerland, no, and he's not interested in me."
Jade wasn't sure this was true. Aiden had said a couple of things lately that had made her wonder, but he'd certainly never asked her out.
"I'm too busy for a relationship, so it's immaterial. And I've had enough of vets," she added with a small frown.
"Not all vets are like two-timing Antonio. Anyway, who said anything about a relationship? You could have some fun, couldn't you?"
"I am having fun, sorting this place out."
"Jade, this is work, not fun." Sarah screwed up her face in exasperation and put her hands on Jade's arms. "I know you've had a rough time of it lately, and I know that's why you've buried yourself in deepest Wiltshire with a bunch of waifs and strays no one else wants. I'm not completely blind, you know." Her blue eyes softened. "But you can't hide yourself away forever. There's a world out there."
"I'm not hiding,"
Jade protested, gazing across the fields of long grass that surrounded her land. The grass, bleached yellow by the sun, flowed like a golden sea in the sultry breeze.
"I'm fine now. Truly I am."
She waved her hands in a careless gesture of dismissal, daring Sarah to argue with her.
"I'm over everything. Antonio, my old life, Mum, all the stuff in Bristol. Well, it all seems like it happened to someone else. Really, I'm fine."
She rushed on before Sarah could contradict her.
"If Ben wants to feed Sasha's pups, I'm just about to do it. Do you want to give him a shout?"
Sarah shook her head in exasperation and then put her fingers to her lips and gave an ear-splitting whistle. Jade breathed a sigh of relief and hurried ahead of her to unlatch the metal gate that led down to the lower part of the sanctuary. She'd had 2 stone outbuildings turned into a reception and a feed storage area, And in the old pigsty hospital block, quiet and out of bounds to the public, she kept the smaller, more vulnerable animals until they were ready for rehoming. Dogs like Sasha and her litter of scraggy black Heinz 57 pups. Not that the fact they were scraggy bothered Jade. Sometimes she thought she cared about the ugly ones more than she cared about the sleek, expensive pedigrees that were guaranteed a loving home. They brought out all her protective instincts. She'd have kept them all if she'd had the money. She tugged open the wooden door of the feed store, bashed her head on the low beam just inside, and swore under her breath. After years of living in houses with normal height ceilings, she still hadn't got used to the low doorways of the farm buildings. Her cottage wasn't much better. When she'd first moved in 6 weeks ago, she'd banged her head so many times she'd found herself going around with a permanent stoop. She'd got used to the place now, and only the odd doorway like this one still caught her out. Standing for a moment in the dim coolness of old stone, she rubbed her head and then hauled down a sack of dog food ready for Ben to open. She wondered what Sarah would have said if she'd confessed the only man she'd felt completely comfortable around lately had been the one that she'd met in the cemetery, despite the fact she'd spent most of their meeting blubbing. She'd have bet money on it that he hadn't been comfortable, however chivalrously he'd behaved. She'd never met a man who'd been able to deal with a woman in tears. None of the vets in Bristol had been very good with tears, especially Antonio, who should have been used to it, considering how many hearts he broke. Perhaps Sarah was right. Perhaps she wasn't quite as recovered as she thought. Antonio had hurt her badly, and she'd still been reeling from his betrayal when she'd lost her mother. 2 devastating body blows in a matter of months. It was bound to take time to recover. But Duck Pond Rescue was going to help her, not hinder. Hard work was a cure-all, her mother had often said. It cured everything from the pain of a broken love affair to the absolute full stop of bereavement. Jade had to admit her mother had been right about that. She was too busy to hurt most of the time. She reached up for the plastic scoop and one of the pristine stainless steel dog bowls from the shelf and put them on the floor beside the sack of food. As for Sarah's throwaway